Thanks so much for coming tonight and for having me here, and it's good to see some familiar faces. If you saw the video that we played, I think we played it a minute ago and played it in our services. You know, we had in the background in that music, you know, softly and tenderly, and I love that old hymn, and calling you who are weary, come home, come home. I resisted that call for a very long time. And if you saw the picture there too, of me with Ravi Zacharias, for those of y'all who follow him, the great Christian apologist, defender of the faith of our time. Ravi and I talked about that and much more when I met with him in Atlanta. And one story that Ravi tells is about a missionary couple in Iran, a husband and wife team in a country where to witness for Jesus Christ is to risk everything, life and liberty. And they were traveling across Iran, came to the edge of the desert, where there was a trading post there. And at that trading post, they stopped for supplies. And just as they pulled up, there was this really menacing looking figure leaned up against the trading post, much like some of the images we see on TV now. And he had the bullet belts across his chest. He had an AK-47 strap there. And the woman, the wife, looks to her husband, missionary, and she said, "I think the Lord wants you to witness to him." And that horrified her husband, and he jumped out and ran in for supplies quickly and passed the guy and passed right by him again coming out. And he got in the car as they were driving off. His wife looked at him and said, she said, you didn't witness to that man, did you? And he said, no. He said, crazy woman. He said, look at him. Do you want to be a widow? And she began to pray. And she said, oh, Lord, please open my husband's eyes and open his heart and let him see that you want him to witness to that man. And so he said, okay, you want me to die? I will. He turns around, he goes back to the trading post, and he pulls up, and the guy's leaning there and looking dangerous. He takes a deep breath, and he gets his Bible, and he gets out, and he walks up to that man and extends it to him. He said, this is for you. Immediately, tears began to stream down the face of the man. And he looked at the missionary and he said, 3 days ago, an angel appeared to me and told me to walk across the desert and to wait here, that a man would bring me the book of life. Long ago, in 2006, I was on my own desert, and a man brought me the book of life. And he brought me the book of life when I was in solitary confinement in an awful prison cell in Atlanta, Georgia. That surprises a lot of people who don't know the story. And how did I get there? I grew up here in the Tupelo area in the 50s and 60s when there was a clear delineation between right and wrong and black and white, and all of our TV shows and our movies. You know, I always wanted to be the guy in the white hat, you know, the guy who rode in and cleaned up Dodge and, you know, righted wrongs and rescued the damsel in distress. And so consequently, a week after high school, or Judy and I went to high school back in those days together, I caught a train in Corinth in 1966, rode all night, part of the next day into Union Station in Washington, D.C. to become a fingerprint technician for the FBI. I met a lot of interesting people there, including J. Edgar Hoover. Also, it was a dangerous place even then to be out and about in socially. I was mugged 3 times. Once a guy with a gun, and another group tried to stab me, and then a third group who did assault me, and they broke my nose. And I was very fortunate to be alive, but God was always there bringing me through things time and again in my life. And growing up, I knew that I had, in my limited way, as a nominal Christian, raised in a church, but totally ignorant of the personal relationship with Jesus Christ. I knew I had favor of God, but I didn't understand it, and I ran from it. And I was certain that he was really busy with other people who really needed him. And I just take care of business on my own. And so finally, I decided to come home from Washington because I'd wanted to be an agent, and I knew I needed to come home and get into to Ole Miss. And so I came home. Oops, I got married. Excuse me just a second. Got married to Susan Jackson here in Tupelo. And Susan and I were living in a little drafty duplex up on North Church Street, and I commuted my last year to Ole Miss and did graduate just about the time that President Nixon had declared the first war on drugs. And I heard all about that, about the DEA and the new Mississippi Bureau of Narcotics, and I thought, well, gosh, that must be the place for me. So I joined the Bureau and went deep undercover. And in those days, if you were working solo undercover, which we did a lot, there weren't very many of us. And if you got in trouble, the posse wouldn't come in to rescue you because there wasn't a posse, there weren't very many of us. So in 1972, down in South Mississippi, I was working solo undercover doing a heroin deal, and the heroin deal went all wrong. And the dealers had just decided that they were going to keep their product, take my money, and kill me. And in that winning calculation they made. And so at midnight, I went in this house and out in the middle of a swamp, and it was like a scene out of every bad B horror movie that you've ever seen. And they pulled guns on me, began to talk about where to dump my body, once they had killed me. And the one sitting across from me began to chew up and swallow and eat double-edged Gillette razor blades. And he began to bleed at the mouth, and blood streaming down on his throat. And he took a whole box of long-stem kitchen matches, lit all of them at once in a big flame, and he buried his blood-soaked face into the flame. It was that moment that my whole life flashed before my eyes, and I thought I was going to die. And I did something I didn't do very often. I prayed. But I didn't pray for deliverance. I didn't think I deserved to pray for that. I prayed just to see one more sunrise after all the sunrises I had slept through in my life. But God delivered me that night, and then the next year in 1973, as an investigator placed outside of Jackson, up in the northwest part of the state, investigated an organized crime stronghold up near Memphis in DeSoto County. It was much like the old Walking Tall movie, really, if you ever saw that. Mafia and Dixie Mafia operating there, a lot of corruption. And we hit that, and after a long investigation, we're very successful. Had an informant inside the organization, and an informant told me that they weren't real happy with me, and that they'd been meeting talking about hiring someone to kill me. And I was young and thought I'd live forever, and I thought it was pretty bad business too for them to kill a state police officer. So I ignored it, and then one day I got a call from someone offering information to me for what we had missed. And so I agreed to meet this person to get that information. I felt kind of bad about it, but I left, and just after I left, the informant called the house to tell Susan, my wife then, that it was a setup and they were going to kill me. And my police radio had gone out, and so they couldn't raise me on the radio. Susan couldn't. And when I got there, there was not one but two waiting on me, and there were some dangerous guys, and a long story, but it was a standoff, and everybody with their guns and everything, so it was quite a situation. And then in '76, when I was a supervisor and first captain for the North Mississippi in the Bureau, the agents were going to do a heroin deal in Columbus, and they'd set up the deal. They'd bought from these people before, going to do a large amount, draw people out. So that cold day in November of '76 came, and I was leaving my office at the old TNS building. For those of y'all who might remember it, it's gone now, down by the post office. And I ran down to jump in the car, always running late to meet the agents, cranked up, put my hand on the gear shift, and just as I did, the Spirit just filled up the car, all around me, through me, in me, everywhere. I never experienced anything like that in my life, and it scared me to death. And the voice, just as clearly as I heard Brother Keith's voice earlier tonight, said, "Go back and get the bulletproof vest." And then it was gone. And I was kind of terrified, mystified, and I said, "I'm losing my mind. This is crazy." And I said, "We have no reason to believe it's going to be more dangerous than usual." And so I put my hand up again on the gear shift. When I did, the Spirit came right back in the car, wrapped all around me and all through me. And again, the voice came, and it wasn't optional. Go back and get the vest. And so I went back to get the vest, and the vest in those days had no armor in them. They'd only stop up to a 38. And the agents didn't like to wear them. They was bulky and hard to conceal when they were working undercover, even though it was November. But I got it. I met the agents and told them I wanted them to wear the vest during the deal, and they didn't want to. But I said, "Humor me. Don't ask me why." And so it wasn't long before the deal got away from the city of Columbus, where we could stay close on them on surveillance, out in the country on this road and high embankment. And there up on this high embankment, with depressions on either side and a railroad trestle running across here, there was a clump of pine trees up by that railroad trestle. And they had a sniper planted right in behind those pine trees with a high-powered rifle. And when the agents went to do the hand-to-hand deal and arrest their Confederates on the scene, he just poured down high-powered rifle fire onto the agents. It was horrible. It was a dark day that day, and it looked like all the light had just been squeezed out of the world. And later that night, it would come this giant freeze and freeze everything from Jackson to Corinth, like something I had never seen. And it was an awful time. And we came across a levee, caught in the crossfire, gun smoke drifting everywhere, people screaming in the radio, "They're over here, bang, 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 bang," shooting at shadows. And then the female agent radioing me and said, "Merle, Jerry's hit bad. He's hit bad." And she got him into the car and took him out, even as we were still looking for the sniper and everybody was firing. And he fled, the sniper, and we finally secured the scene. And I left to go to the hospital. As I walked in the hospital, there was a female agent looking as if she was 100 years old. Her partner had just been wounded in front of her. She had wounded one of the violators. I tried to comfort her as best I could, and then went to where the violator was and arrested him. And then when I walked into the ER, they had my friend, an agent, laid out, and they were cutting the clothes off of him and cutting the vest off of him, and the white vest was soaked crimson in blood. And the doctor said, "Merle, come look at this." He was hit in the lower extremities of one round, another one sliced through his arm, and then this one hit him in the chest. And it penetrated the vest because it was not designed to stop a high-powered rifle. But it took some of the punch out of it, and it deflected it. So when it went in behind his right breast, skittered around the barrel of his rib cage, and popped out behind his left breast. The doctor looked at me and he said, "Merle, if he had not had that vest on, it had taken out his heart and lungs, he'd been dead before he hit the ground." Then, as now, chill bumps from my head down to my toes, even though that was almost 50 years ago. And I knew God had intervened and he had saved us. I tell you, you could almost feel the shuffle of angels' feet around us that day, and that pursuing presence that I knew was always back there somewhere after me, and that feeling that I was once being pursued, and I was also pursuing myself, and that it was the hound of heaven, as I would find out. So you would think after all of this I'd been through, I'd be getting it by now. but I still didn't. I didn't understand, and I still ran from it. And I said, well, I don't understand that, and I'm going to just be the best person I can and just double down on works-based salvation. As I was telling some folks earlier, I figured the ledger over here was, when good stuff was really heavy, it outweighed that bad stuff over here, and everything would be okay. They'd kind of check it off one day at the door, and I'd be allowed in. And of course, it doesn't work that way. And right after that, I had to head up a high-profile internal affairs investigation of a corrupt governor who was trying to corrupt our agency, and some bad things were happening, and I was assigned to do that, and that was very unpleasant. And there was some tampering done by politicians with our witnesses. I had to call and threaten to resign and to call a news conference to get them to back off. But we prevailed in the short term, and justice was done, we thought, and but then they began to see, how they might retaliate. And people would call me from Jackson warning me that they were trying to find a way to taint me somehow or frame me with something so they could come after me openly, since the press seemed to like me. And so finally it became untenable, and I left the job that I loved and the people that I loved, and very tearful parting. And the corporate world had offered me a position as a security manager in the Bell system. And so I went there and began to double down again, as I said, on my good works, and trying to be just as perfect as I could be in the perfectionist, obsessive way that I had. And I became also involved in politics, high-level politics. I was Ronald Reagan's state criminal justice chairman, began to meet a lot of interesting people. And then I began to migrate across the corporation in different jobs and different locations in Mississippi and in Birmingham, and finally into Georgia, over around Augusta, where I became district manager and spokesman for the company. And those were very heady days, some might say in a temporal sense only, because I was very high profile in the media a lot, speaking for the company. I was chairman of this board and president of that fund drive, and the corporate jet would stop in Augusta from Atlanta and pick me up and take me to dinners in Washington, with people in Congress and that sort of thing. And but in the midst of it all, Susan's health was becoming much worse. She had type 1 diabetes, and since she was a child, and began to have a lot of side effects and a lot of trips to the hospital, and a lot of operations. In the process of all that, the awards from man were just piling up, mostly in my closet, because they meant less and less to me, like an addict who had to keep having a fix. You were building tolerance, and you'd get this award, and you'd say, well, that's great, and it just, any momentary satisfaction you got was short-lived, and then it was gone. And so after a while, even though they were announcing that I was getting this award, I didn't even want to go to the ceremony. I was off on down the road trying to find another thing to do to get that fix. And I always had this feeling that, that there was this barrier of complexity in life. If I would just strain enough, I could burst through that complexity, past simplicity, burst through complexity, and then I'd find that true simplicity on the far side of complexity, and that peace that I so desperately was seeking, not knowing all along that it was Jesus Christ who was right there with me. In the middle of all of that, many things happened, but our congressman called me and said, there's a newcomer who's going to challenge this corrupt incumbent legislator. We'll help you quietly if you'll agree to chair her campaign, kind of secret, and help raise money that we need to do this. I knew there'd be consequences, but I agreed to it, and things were going pretty well. And then, of course, this leaked and that leaked, and they figured out who was behind her campaign and directing it. And so one night late at the house, this incumbent called me, and he said, talking about the woman who was challenged, and he said, I'm going to break up her marriage. I'm going to break up her family. I'm going to run her out of the state. I'm going to destroy her, Merle. Do you hear me? And then when he hung up, another friendly call came in from the newspaper editor, and because the newspaper backed him. And he told me, you've got to cease and desist. We played a big role in the image you have. We made you, and we can break you. And so I just doubled down again. And we went on to work really hard, and she upset that incumbent by a wide margin. And they called it the greatest political upset in Georgia in 50 years. And there was much happiness, but it was short-lived, and as I knew it would be. Then some political figures went to my superiors in Atlanta and told them that virtually no political legislation that the company wanted would move until they dealt with me and muted me or neutered me or whatever it was. I had to be punished. And so then the company I love called me to Atlanta, and I was their top-rated manager at that time in that department, to tell me that I had to give up these crusades, that they meant nothing. Who do you think you are? And you're going to stop this now, and you're going to be a good boy and go back and make money for the corporation, because the here and now is all there is. Broke my heart, very sad. I immediately knew that I couldn't stay again, and I asked for a buyout and for early retirement. And just as I was processing that, the congressman who had asked me to intervene tried to intervene for me and tried to get an appointment for me as U.S. Marshal in the Southern District with the new Bush administration that had just come into office. And unfortunately, the U.S. Senator who would have had the authority to make all those recommendations for new administrations, he was a friend of mine, but he had suddenly died of an aneurysm at 62. And so it fell into fighting amongst many politicians of that party, and they weren't real keen on the guy who had just defeated an incumbent, for after all, they were incumbents. And so we finally recognized that no amount of trips to Washington was going to rescue that. And about that time, the state superintendent of schools, an elected position, the Georgia superintendent, offered me a job as deputy state superintendent of education, because I'd been a well-known education reform activist for a long time and served as a chamber chairman on education and chaired superintendent searches for local systems and that kind of thing. And so, against my better judgment, and I wasn't thinking, I should have just taken some time out and stayed home and regrouped and took care of Susan, but I wanted one more battle. I wanted to go slay the dragons again. And surely if I did that, if I went up there, I'd show them, whoever I was trying to show. And if I could win one more big battle, and I knew they were having a battle in Atlanta at that time, so Susan and I got an apartment in Atlanta and I went up there, and it was a pretty awful situation because the superintendent was of one party and the governor was of another party, and the governor appointed the State Board of Education that we had to meet with every month. So it was just, it was a disaster waiting to happen, and it was very ugly, and the board meetings each month were like running the gauntlet. They were very political, and the poor career employees got caught in the crossfire, and we'd see them before they testified in the restroom throwing up. And one lady got so sick and that worked there and broke out in hives and had a miscarriage. And so it was a bad situation. And then it became even worse because the governor, who was kind of building a shadow government, their kind of extra legal government, as we called it, decided he needed money to fund all of that. So he had all of this money we had coming from Washington, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in federal education money. And he told us he'd like to have some of that. And we told him, well, we can't do that. That would be illegal and supplanting state funds with federal funds, which is, you can't do that. And so then he began to run us, as the board members did, and we went to Washington to the U.S. Department of Education. And they were horrified that they were trying to get that agreement to divert money. And the U.S. Secretary, the Assistant U.S. Secretary of Education, called me from Washington and said, Merle, we know what's going on, and said, hold the line, hold the line, hold the line, and we'll prosecute anyone who tries to divert this money. And so then time went by and we got a call from a friendly source in the White House who told us that you guys are being thrown under the bus. And a deal has been made with that governor to endorse the new No Child Left Behind bill, which was an ill-conceived bill, in my opinion. And so after that happened, I got the infamous conference call from Washington. Gone were the Assistant Secretary and the U.S. Secretary of Education, who had heard this, had repeated to us this hold the line charge that the Assistant Secretary gave us. They were nowhere to be found. And this room full of politicos from the White House and USAID and who knows where else were on there, and they called just to tell me, inform me that they were going to allow the governor and his people just to divert whatever they wanted to divert. And that they said, we'll defer considerations of prosecution to a later date, a date, of course, which would never have come. And yeah, so it was a bad situation. It got much worse. I tell you, at times like that, when you're fighting those kind of battles and you're sweeping your offices, having them swept for bugs on your line, you're getting threats. People are calling you to say, you know, they're wanting to catch y'all out on the road and stop you and arrest you and hurt you. Be careful, and on in that environment. And you don't have that shield of Jesus Christ. You don't have that faith in Him, that perspective. You know, that this is just a temporal world and it's all fading away, but it all seems so critically important at that time that we defeat these people. And so we made some very bad decisions. And at first, the superintendent tried to spend all the money she could to keep it away from them by making grants to schools. And then when that ran short, she decided just to double down herself and run for governor against him. And so she qualified to run, and you know, then those moments came where, you know, you began to believe you're in the Alamo, and as a siege mentality takes over, and you kind of get turned around once in life with your eyes closed and your conscience muted, because you're justifying, well, you know, we could step out here a little bit and become a little bit like them to defeat them. And that dangerous thinking, that first step out on that slippery slope starts. And that's what happened. And then and my relationship with the superintendent became much too close and just inappropriate. And then a vendor came forward who wanted contracts. And when we were meeting with him, with a wink and an eye, and he kind of let the superintendent know that if his good services were contracted, he would send funds back to her campaign. And by then, I'd been asked to transition over and to leave and chair the campaign. And so the contracts were let by the superintendent, and then money was brought into her campaign from the vendor. And because all the money had been dried up to her from both parties, they were not supportive of her run. And she lost that race. And then as we all came home, within a year or so, our federal agent showed up at my door one day. And the tables were kind of turned on me, the old law enforcement officer. And they informed me that we were being indicted, ironically enough, for a diversion of federal funds, and saying that these were federal funds that had flowed to him and now had come back to the campaign. So we had those terrible meetings, and it began to dawn on me, what I had put at risk, for this temporal battle that was just a passing thing, just fading away in the world. And that I had put in danger my position as Susan's caregiver, because I'd been her caregiver for over 35 years. And it was as bad as I can tell you, and I can't really tell you how bad it really was, how desperate it was. And those times when, you confront yourself and you look at yourself in the mirror and you say, who are you? I don't know you, I don't like you. And when you just fall down and just begin to retch, in the bathroom and that kind of thing, and explaining it all. So I decided the best I could do was try to minimize the damage, because I looked at the federal conviction rate and it's 96, 98%. Virtually no one wins against the federal government these days. And so I decided to just go ahead and plead and agree to testify if anybody went to trial and tell what I knew, honestly. I told the superintendent of my intentions, and she told me she wasn't with her good guys. We hadn't done anything. And so the prosecutors and I never really liked each other very much, and I became very angry with them. And one night I lost my mind and I broke my plea agreement. And I told the superintendent, I contacted her against my plea agreement and told her that I would tell the truth on the stand if she went to court. So then she decided she would plea, and then she told them that I'd called her. And so they switched horses and changed their story and decided to use her, their main target, as their witness against the vendor. And when I showed up to testify, they arrested me and locked me up in the jail cell in Atlanta, an awful place, in isolation, where there were really some tough people in that jail, and they put me in isolation because our case was so high profile, so I might not be killed. But it was in that place that the man came to me and brought me that book of life I talked about and gave me that Bible. And there I read like never before, I prayed like never before, and I was broken there in that jail cell and born again there. And I wasn't allowed out with anybody. I had no contact, and then men began to pour to my door who had never seen me, to sit in the floor. All of a sudden, they began to pour to my door, to look at me through the little hole in the door and confess horrible crimes, murder, seeking forgiveness, absolution. I didn't understand it, and I felt so inadequate. And I asked God, what is this? And he showed me this is the way it's going to be now between us, and it'll only increase. And that in my way, in my works-based salvation and plan and in the world, that I was always extending a helping hand to people to pull them up, but that I might know Christ and his coming down to mankind, that I would be brought down into this world I would have never experienced, and to know Christ. I applied and got bail against all odds again to go home with Susan, get my affairs in order, because we knew that other nice deal I had of probably no time or very, very little time, or probably probation. We knew that was gone. And then they announced they were giving me 8 years. 8 years, unthinkable. And the day I had to leave Susan was the hardest day in my life. To leave her sitting there in her wheelchair, and she'd had heart attacks and strokes. And to leave her, it was a very hard time. When I got to the prison camp in Edgefield, South Carolina, came up the hill, and there were 535 men waiting on me because they had seen it on TV, and they had seen the superintendent assuming victim status. And because I worked for the government and imprisoned them, they and some staff decided they were going to make life hard, and they did. But out of that, a group of Christians came down and took me, embraced me, took me under their wings, and there I understood, and there in prison over that time is where I met some of the greatest Christians I've ever known. And then the Lord showed me that He wanted me to start an inmate ministry inside, and we created a Christian movie night ministry against all odds, and we packed that out. Every time we showed a new Christian movie, men showed up who had never darkened the door of a church, and they would begin to sob and weep to the approach of the Holy Spirit as their heart was softened. And we just saw so many miracles there, and that went on in 3 institutions I was in. It went on to be what we think is the most successful inmate-led ministry in the history of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And then Susan died not too long after I'd gone in. And I was wallowing in my pity one day in my bed, and we had little radios that we could pick up. If we were lucky, we could pick up a distant broadcast in that remote place of a Christian radio station. But that day it was nothing but static coming in. And suddenly, lying there in my bunk, wallowing in my pity, the static was gone, and a crystal clear transmission came in from a pastor that I had never heard before and never heard again. And he said, "You there, you there." And I opened my eyes, it was so direct, and I half sat up, and he said, "Yes, I'm talking to you." He said, "It's not noble what you're doing, lying there wallowing in your pity. You get out of that bed and you get about your Father's business." And I did. And I was later transferred to Millington and near Memphis. Great place there, but a lot of problems there too with gangs and some staff that were protective of those gangs. And I was leading men, trying to lead them to Christ and away from the gangs, and they weren't happy about it. And I had become the Sunday night inmate pastor for the services there. And they began to threaten to kill me, hurt me, plant stuff in my room, so friendly staff would come by, find it, and they would have an excuse to ship me to the other side of the world, to the desert in Arizona, where I'd never see family or friends again. And there were nights that I went to sleep clutching a little cross around my neck, a cross, by the way, that's forbidden to be displayed in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Any other religion can display the symbols of their faith, but not the cross. But I kept mine despite many rebukes, and I would clutch it at night, not knowing sometimes if I'd live to see morning. But we did a movie ministry there and at another place, and they were very successful. But also in the middle of that bad time, God sent me Judy. And Judy began to come to visit me, and we knew right away pretty soon that God was at work here. Her husband, we were all friends, he died the same year Susan did, and so in December 23rd, 2010, we were married in a visiting room at Millington, and we've never looked back. It was also there in prison that I promised God that I'd write 3 books about this whole experience, written as fiction, but based on this, my story and his story of redemption, that I would go forth and show the world my redeemed life, that they might want to meet my Redeemer. And so I began to write A Ghostly Shade of Pale, and then A Rented World came out in December, and God willing, in about a year, the final chapter called The Redeemed will be out. And I learned many things inside, and God took all bitterness and all hate from me and left me nothing but his love, which is all I need. So even now, when I get attacked by usually non-believers, I just look at them and say, I feel no love from you, but I love you because he loved me when I was alone and thought I was unlovable. And I also learned too inside that there are many types of prisons. The kind I was in, the prison of the mind and the heart I was in before I went there. And there's a lot of people outside who are in prison. And all those people are worthy of our love and our forgiveness. And when I hear sometimes somebody being a little harsh, I said, well, we have a bad habit. I've learned we have a bad habit in life of freezing people at who we think they were yesterday or a year ago or 5 years ago. So aren't you glad God didn't do that to us before he sent his son to die for us on the cross for my sins and your sins? And so Judy and I see miracles on the road all over America. We are so blessed. I got nothing I asked for, but everything I could have hoped for. And among men, I am most blessed. And we're out to tell everybody our story and warn about the dangers of this rented world we live in, where there's so much danger and so much darkness. I sure am blessed to be here. We love this church. There's so much love in this church, and we just feel fortunate to be here, to know Keith and to know everybody here. Thank you for having me, Keith, and if anybody would like any signed books, we have some out at the table we'll be signing, but thank you all so much, and God bless you.